Hello world, I'm Whitney Bandel and welcome to another video from my HTML and CSS course. In this video we will be looking at flexbox and grid layouts. So what I would like for you to do to start getting set up is to download these 6 files, bird 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are actually in your textbook. We're going to kind of follow along pretty closely with the book and use some of the examples that they have to kind of make things a little bit more streamlined and easy. If you want an alternative to downloading these files individually, what you can actually do is you can go to the Files section and then look for the folder that says birds, and if you go over here you can just download the whole folder. So that's going to be the quickest way to get all of these. I do have some other resources too that we're going to kind of take a look at. Here I have links to the CSS Flexbox, 960 grid system, grid layout module, breaking the grid. We're going to take a look at all of these as we kind of go along. There's some really great examples that are going to just kind of help give you different examples to work with, which will help when you start trying to make your own Flexbox and grid system layouts. Now, in the previous lectures, we've taken a look at creating multi-column websites by being able to use different containers. It could be creating an actual div and then having a div float to the left or float to the right, or it could be using a section element and putting a section so that it floats to the left or the right, or having them be sized so that way they're not taking up the whole screen. You could actually even have them also, they display as inline so that they all just kind of fit within that space. And those work perfectly fine. For the student examples that I have for the 4th edition, that's actually what they did for their final projects. What you may want to consider for your final project is using the Flexbox and grid layout. And the reason I say this is because the homework assignments are going to have you use them and continue to use them. So that's going to be what you end up being most familiar with. It can be a little bit more tricky though, so you want to make sure that you follow along with the book and you do all of the examples from this chapter to help you get a little bit more comfortable. This is where these resources are also going to be very helpful for you. So let's go ahead and open up our text editor. I'll just call this Flex. And we'll just start this the same way that we normally would. For title, we're going to start with the CSS flexible box. So we'll have that in our title. And we do want to leave, space to add some embedded styles. Now there's going to be 2 different methods that we're going to look at, and the first is going to be the flexible box layout, and the second is going to be a grid layout. And they're going to differ in their applications. For the flexible layout, we're looking at creating content and organizing it based off of either a single row or a single column. So we can choose the direction that it's going to move in, but it can't be multiple columns or multiple rows. So we're looking at more of a local relationship. The grid layout is going to allow for us to actually organize elements that are going to be able to have both multiple columns and multiple rows. So the grid layout is something that you would use more for an entire page, and the flexible box is going to be more for a smaller section. So it could be having your general page layout, and then maybe in your main section you'll have multiple sections that will all be organized in this space. And that's actually really similar to what your homework assignment is going to have you do. It's going to have you organize these elements in this smaller space. Now, there's some benefits of working with the flexible containers. As I mentioned, you have to choose whether you want to work with it horizontally or vertically. You can use a flex box to change the order of and display of the elements. Actually, I'm gonna have us go ahead and write these notes in here just so that way you have them. We can always go back and remove these if we want. All right, so first we're gonna have configured in one dimension, either horizontal or vertical. Used to change order of display of the elements. The flexible box layout is well suited for responsive web design. It has recently reached W3C recommendation status. So back when I was teaching from the 4th edition, there was mention in the textbook of Flexbox and grid layout, but it was still sort of at this point where it was becoming supported enough. Now it is supported and recommended enough that it's actually being integrated into the textbook. So that's one of the big changes of what we're kind of looking at and what's new to this version. And then also just kind of something to be mindful of, that this is kind of becoming more and more supported and more often used. Usually used to configure a specific area of a web page rather than a whole page. So again, we're thinking locally, we're not thinking overall. This is something that you want to take into consideration. Use the display property. So this is one area that I think students tend to get a little bit confused. This will make more sense too when we start really working with it, but we are going to have some sort of container that is going to contain all of these pieces that we're wanting to organize. And you can think of it as sort of the parent container, and then we're going to have the children inside of it. And so you are going to want to apply your display property to that kind of parent container, and then we are going to change how those children of that parent are going to react and behave. So we are going to want to use the display property. We'll take a look at how to do that in a little bit. Flex indicates flexible block container. Inline flex indicates a flexible inline display container. And I'm getting all these notes from the book. You can always go back and take a look at these. So we have each child element with a flex container is a flex item. So it's going to be sort of up to you to determine what's going to make the most sense to use for a flexible container. Obviously, you'd want to have multiple items. It needs to be something that could either be in a single row or a single column. In the case of the homework assignment, it's going to be these sections that are all part of the main area. The example from the book, which I really like, that uses these bird images, is creating an image gallery. So this is something where maybe if you didn't have this flexible layout, you could still work with having the images. Images by default have an inline display, so you could very easily place your images into your web page and just have them listed next to each other. And then it would be a matter of changing the padding and the margins to alter your images. What's really great though about the flexible box layout is the properties that you can use with it can change the kind of visuals in a similar way to adding the padding and the margins, where you can have them change responsively to fit the content. This will make more sense once we actually go through the example of working with the gallery. But it really just kind of helps give you more options for allowing your content to behave in a responsive manner. So we're going to go ahead and work with our HTML first. We can leave this up here just for your notes. But what we're really looking for is to create some content underneath. So I'm just going to add an extra space. We're going to create a div. I'm going to give it an ID called gallery. And then this is going to be basically the same as what is in your textbook. We're going to have our image, source, bird1.jpg. And I'm going to need to remember to, actually, I'll probably just do this real quick. I need to make sure that I put all of this in the same location. So I've downloaded my birds file. So depending on how you have your file saved, like probably what would be easiest for you to do would be to add Flex into the bird folder. We could do that real quick. What we could also do is we could leave this, they're both on the desktop. So what I could do instead is I could type in, let's see, what is this? Birds. And make that lowercase. So I could do birds / So that would work just as well. Just make sure that however you have your file saved, that they're going to match what you actually have. Width. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this first one. We're going to end up with 6 images, so it's fine to just copy it. Just make sure that you update all the information. So we want to change our numbers. Oops. And then we're also going to want to change our descriptions. right, so I should be able to save this. I'm gonna go ahead and open this. Have these just kind of next to each other so we can kind of see what we have already to work with. So without changing anything, adding the flex settings, we can already see by default our images are all inline. They are stacking next to each other as well as they can until there's just not enough space in the window, and then they return to the next line. Right now we have the default padding and margin spacing from the browser. We haven't gone and overwritten that at all. So you should be able to change the size of the window and just kind of see how these are going to behave. So we're going to kind of take a look at a couple of different properties. What I'll probably have us do is add those properties to our notes above, and then we'll just kind of add our birds underneath. So I'm going to add a H2. And I'm going to say flex wrap property. The flex wrap property configures whether flex items are displayed on multiple lines. No wrap, default, configures single line display or single column display. Wrap allows flex items to display on multiple lines or columns. Whoops. And then wrap reverse puts them in the reverse order. So this is going to be our first property, is looking at how we want our flex items to behave. So we're going to go up to the top with our styles. And here we're going to actually start with our style for the gallery. So we want to put our gallery ID. Display is going to be set to flex. So that's something you want to remember, is the container that has these children is what actually is going to need the display set to flex. And then after this, we are going to add our actual flex property. So we're going to do flex wrap, and we can just set this to wrap for starters. You can save this, refresh. And so what you'll see is now we don't have any padding. They're all right up against each other. And then as they no longer fit in the window, they're going to move down onto the next line. So in a lot of cases, you could say they're behaving pretty much the same. We could go and we could replace this though. So we could do no wrap. So what would happen here is that the images aren't going to wrap as they end up going beyond the window size. We instead get this scroll bar. So somebody would have to scroll. Whoops. And then we can try out wrap reverse. So wrap reverse is going to have the images move on to the next line, but kind of favoring the bottom line is having most of the images, and then if there's not room, it's going to stack up above. So I'm going to put this back to wrap. And then we'll go ahead and we'll go on to the next property. And that's going to be, add a little bit of space. That's going to be the flex direction. Whoops. Flex direction property. Now this is going to allow for us to choose if we want this to be a column or if we want this to be a row. As I mentioned before, we're only really allowed to choose one direction that we want to work with. Might just add an unordered list to this because these are kind of shorter notes. So we have value row is the default and configures a horizontal flow direction. Column configures a vertical flow direction. Row reverse configures a horizontal flow with the flex items in reverse order. And then we have column reverse configures a vertical flow with flex items in reverse order. So we have 4 options to choose from in this case. We can have it behave horizontally, vertically, the reverse order of both of those. So we can go back to the top and add in our flex direction, and we can choose if we want it to be set to row. Oops. So we're not going to see anything different just because this is the default. We do have our notes added above. So what we could try though is column. Now we're going to have all of our birds stacked above each other. So we're not going to see the wrap behave quite the same just because we have so much space. We're not actually like it's since our pages are used to scrolling vertically anyways, really our page is just going to kind of do a continual scroll. So we're not going to see too much of a difference. We could go ahead and we could try like column reverse, but with the column we're not really going to notice. We could try the row reverse, and here we're going to see this behave differently. So we have our flex wrap property, which if we reverse that, we would have our images kind of prefer the bottom row, and then the extra ones would stack over top. This is kind of similar. What we're doing now though is we are having it wrap from the right side of the page instead of the left side. So plenty of options for us to work with. I think I'm going to go ahead and put this back to row. We're going to go back to our notes. We'll add another H2, and we're going to take a look at justify content. Whoops. The justify content property. I'm going to do this under a paragraph. The justify content property is used to configure how the browser should display extra space along the main axis in the Flex container. So the options that we have are flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around. Now, page 261 has a good demonstration of this. So in the textbook on page 261, we have some examples of the justified content. So flex start, what it's going to do is the images are going to all begin and line up on the starting left point, and then any excess white space is going to show to the right. If we do flex end, it'll be the opposite. The images are going to remove all of the excess white space on the right side and they're going to add it to the left. If it's centered, it's going to take whatever that distance is and it's going to divide it in two, so that way half of it's going to be on the right, half is going to be on the left. Space between is going to divide that white space and place it in between the images or the children of the Flex container, whatever it may be. And space around is going to add a little bit of space to the left and right, and then also additional white space in between each of the different children of that container. So this is where it could actually be very beneficial to use a Flex container instead of going and adding individual padding and white space around each of your elements. This is going to allow for the Flex container to do a lot of the thinking of how to handle the white space rather than you having to think about the different percentages or the different M's that you might want to use. Now, I think this is also a good time to take a look at some of our links. So in Canvas, I have a link to the Flex box in general, and we'll just kind of take a look at this. We'll kind of go back and forth between, here we just have a general Flex box, which is this blue background space, and then we have each of these individual children. Here they have some information about working with block, inline. They have information about the browser support. So this is giving an example. In their case, they have this div that's called a Flex container, and then they have individual divs inside of it. Really what you need to think about is that relationship between whatever the parent container is and those children that are going to be inside of it. It doesn't matter if it's a div, in our case it's an image. In the homework assignment, there are different sections. But the parent element is going to be what you're going to add this display that is set to Flex as. And then you're going to add these other properties. So here we have our Flex direction property. We've already looked at this, being able to stack our images over top of each other. They have some other examples. Here they have the Flex wrap, how it's going to kind of wrap around and fit in this space. Here is an example of that justified content property where they're centering it. They also have an examples of Flex start, Flex end, space around, space between. So you can definitely use this as a place to kind of check out more examples. I'm going to kind of wait to look at some of those just because I want to slowly add these. All right, so since we just added the justified content property, let's go to our styles and actually add this. So we'll do justify content, and then let's do space around. It's kind of a nice one to work with. Then we'll go back to our notes, do another H2, and we'll do align items. Property. We'll do a paragraph for this. Configures the way the browser displays extra space along the cross axis of the container. And then we have flex start, flex end, center, baseline, stretch. So sort of similar. This one is one reason why I really want to look at the W3C examples. So all of these images, they all have the exact same height and width to them. So it makes it hard for us to kind of see what this alignment actually looks like. So what I like about the examples on the W3 schools is it's different enough that we're going to be able to tell the difference between them. So here they have the align items. So it's talking about the cross axis. So we've been kind of looking at the horizontal space between our different items. And so with our example, we're going to be looking at how our items are going to range vertically instead. So again, we can't really see too much just because these boxes are all the same height. They are centered though. This example I do like. So here we have baseline value aligns the flex items such as their baselines align. So the example uses different font sizes to demonstrate that the items get aligned by the text baseline. And you'll notice that even though each of these boxes is a different height, they're all kind of centering along that baseline of the content. So plenty of different examples for you to look at. We can also look at like stretch, where we have the align content stretch. Stretches the flex lines to take up the remaining space. So if there was a bunch of excess space, it would kind of fill it in. We could go ahead and, could go ahead and add this style. We're not really going to see a whole lot, but we can add it anyways. I'm just going to say center. That should be fine. Save that. All right, so underneath align items, we're going to do another property. This one is called the H2 flex flow property. Flex flow is a shorthand property that configures both the flex direction and the flex wrap at the same time. So what we can do is we can go to our styles. And what this is essentially saying is right now we have flex wrap and we have flex direction. And what we can do is instead we could have flex flow, and I can say row wrap instead. So if I wanted to, I could remove this flex wrap and the flex direction because it's technically being overwritten by the flex flow, which is setting the row and the wrap. I'm going to leave both just for the sake of having it in your notes, but you can kind of conserve space by adding the flex flow. All right, so we're going to add some other styles. This is just going to follow along with what the textbook example has. So they also have an image style margin 1M. Box shadow 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 10 pixels. Color of 777. So we can save that. Refresh. And so now we have our birds. They have just a little bit of a shadow underneath of them, making them pop out a little bit more. So if you are interested in doing an image gallery, this could be something that you can kind of consider using. Unfortunately, we're going over this after you've gone ahead and you've done your midterm portfolio project. This would have been something that might have looked really nice with some of your projects, but you could always go back and you could add this if you want to. All right, so we're going to add some more notes to our Flex HTML file. We're not necessarily going to change this example any further. So what I might do is I might just add these notes under the div. And we just kind of keep adding content underneath. So next we're looking at configuring Flex items. Customize the size of each Flex item and indicate whether it can grow, Flex grow factor, or shrink, Flex shrink factor, depending on the size of the browser viewport. This information is in your textbook too, if you want to just kind of take a look at that. We have options of none, initial, flex grow, flex shrink, inflex basis. Do another H2, proportional, flexible item. So in this case, you could designate the proportion that items could flex to each other. And we're going to go back to the W3C example and take a look at some of the examples they have for this. So we might have, for example, flex to, for example, will allow that item to flex twice as large as the other content. End that paragraph. Do another one. So 3-column layout might look like, I'm going to just, so figure 8.10, it's on page 265, has a really good image. And they have, I'm just going to add an unordered list, make this a little easier to organize. They have the navigation has flex 1. The main has a flex of 7. And then they have an aside that has a flex portion of 2. So here's their example. It's not completely illustrated to be exact, but it's pretty close. So we see that our flex is, you can kind of think of this as algebra, where we have technically our navigation would be kind of the ratio that we're basing everything else off of. So our navigation is 1. Our aside should be twice the width of our navigation. The main should be then 7 times the size of the navigation. And so no matter the size that our window is, as it resizes, those ratios those proportions should stay the same. So this is going to be more beneficial than necessarily having to put in different percentages. And then what we would want to do is we would want to use this in conjunction with some other CSS properties. So for example, when our window gets to be so small that it ends up being very difficult to read the items in the navigation, we're probably going to want to overwrite these styles, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So I really like this as an example. We can kind of go back to the Flexbox example, see if there's any other good stuff in here. Here we have this really nice example of perfect centering. So you can kind of go back and look at this later, justify content in inline items. Here's some more information about working with the individual flex items. Here they have the flex shrink, flex grow. We haven't talked about order yet. We'll get into that next. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and have us look at this. But we can, if you want to, you can add this to your notes, whether it's typing it up or writing it somewhere else. So the order property specifies the order of the flex items. If you don't specify an order, they'll just list in the order that you're actually coding your HTML. But we can actually override these with styles. So in this case, you'll see that we have the style, we have the order property, and then we're just setting the order for these numbers. So these divs are listed as 1, 2, 3, 4 in the divs, but then they're showing up in this other order. So we have the one that has 1 in it is showing up in the 3rd location. The one with 2 is in the 2nd location, 3 is in the 4th location, and then 4 is in the 1st location. So you can kind of change those orders around if you wanted to. So you could do the same thing. Like if you had like the navigation, the main, and the aside, we could technically go in and we could actually add order to this as well to put those in a different order. And we might just go ahead and add a note real quick. So we have order property. We can just write what's on here. The order property can change the order of the flex items. We're going to keep scrolling though. And so here we have the flex grow property. So what we can do here is we can determine the rate that these items are going to grow. So they started off the same size, but here we have like 1, 1 for these first 2, and then 8. So this one's going to be 8 times the size of these other 2. Here we have the flex shrink property. So, and you'll see the value must be a number. The default value is going to be 1. So in this case, the default for all of these are 1. Here we have the flex shrink of 0. So this one is not shrinking at all versus all the other ones are shrinking at the same ratio as each other. Here we have a flex basis property, specifies the initial length of a flex item. So here, this is set to be specifically 200 pixels. Here we have more alignment information. And then some nice examples. So you can really get into these to kind of play around with working with image galleries. So this pretty much covers everything we're going to do with the flex box. So I'm going to save this. I do want to take a look at some of these other links. So I have this website. I've probably talked about this before. 960 Grid System is a really great website for being able to look at how you can organize the information on your page. Usually what you're going to really do is you're going to have somebody who's going to design a wireframe, usually have it visually represented in some way, whether it's sketching it out on a piece of paper or it's using a software program, perhaps like Axure or Adobe XD or Sketch, in order to come up with a general wireframe and then pass it on to the person who's going to end up going and actually coding things out. So you really want to think about the actual structure of your website, especially when you're starting to think about user interfaces, user experience. You want people to have the ability to understand your page and think about how everything works together. So this is a really good resource for being able to look at how information is sort of organized based off of different columns. And some of these examples work better than others. If you click on these, it'll kind of show or hide a grid. I don't necessarily always agree with the columns that they're saying fit onto this space. A good number of columns to use, though, when you are thinking about organizing your space. I really prefer 12 columns. 12 columns is going to divide into a single column. It can divide into 2, it can divide into 3, 4, 6, 12. So you have a lot of different options for how you can divide up this space. So we could even kind of take a look at some of these different designs. Like here's a good one where we have the 2 columns and it's also dividing into 3 different sections down below. It has a lot of symmetry to it, so it feels very balanced. Let's see what else we have. This one I really like. It does a lot of interesting things. So here we have essentially kind of our 2 columns with these 2 different images. We have this kind of banner that's going all the way across. We have these 4 logos that are going across, and then we have these previews of the different movie, actually show posters, and those are divided into 6. So this is kind of breaking down in a very symmetrical way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a mirrored symmetry. It's more about having an organization to the structure. So like here we have this really great hero image that's at the top. It's going all the way across. We have these 4 articles that are going across this row. And then we have 2 that are kind of continuing this pattern. So we essentially have kind of 2 columns going up and down. And then we have these featured articles that are moving across, but they line up with the content above. So even though they are merging those columns together, they have the same alignment. And that's one of the things that I feel like a lot of people starting off don't always consider. They think about the local relationships of how information is organized, but they don't always think about the larger visual plane and look at how information connects with other parts of the website. So I would definitely suggest take a look at these, start kind of drawing out and thinking about your space. As far as your homework assignments go, you're really just following the examples of what they have. But this is definitely something that you should consider with the final project and think about how everything lines up with each other. This is another good example. We have our hero image. We have, like, even having this information up here, the navigation lines up on this side. It also lines up here. This lines up over here. We have the same thing. Everything's lining up on the left side. So even if things are a little offset from each other, like we have these 4 illustrations that are offset from these vector graphics, it doesn't really matter because it still feels like everything's tied together. This one I really like because it's not symmetrical. There's a lot of balance to it. You don't have to have your columns be the exact same size. The column over here on the left is more of like 60% of the page versus the area to the right is more like 40%. But because everything's lined up and it has this very strong grid structure to it, it still feels very pleasing to look at. We also have balance between the different colors. And then if you wanted to, we could always kind of click on the grid and see how things are lining up. So that's one resource that you could take a look at. We're gonna look more at this information, this grid layout, as we actually take a look at the code. I also have this resource, Making and Breaking the Grid. This is a really great book for looking at how you can organize information using grids. It's focused more on traditional graphic design and printed material, but a lot of what they look at can be applied to digital media and websites as well. Again, a lot of it is thinking about how to organize the information and think about how it aligns with each other. Where it kind of differs a little bit is this idea that when you are working with material that's printed is you can have a 2-page display, and so how you might have information balance each other out on 2 different pages is going to be a little bit different. But they do have some great examples in here about how you can have that content lined up, whether it's an image, if it's a paragraph of text. All right, so we're going to go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to save as, we'll call this grid.html. Just do our typical template. For the title, let's do CSS grid layout. We'll leave some room for some embedded styles. And then I'm going to save this and open it so we can kind of keep an eye on how it progresses. So in comparison to the Flexbox, as I mentioned, we're focusing on either a single row or a single column. The grid layout is going to allow for us to be able to work with multiple columns or multiple rows or both. So it's going to give us an option of working with the whole of a page rather than a smaller section of a page. So let's actually go to the body section and just kind of like what we did before, we're going to add some notes. So we'll call this CSS grid layout in H1. Then we'll do, let's do an unordered list. And we'll just write down some information about the grid layout. So we can configure a 2-dimensional grid-based layout. We can have fixed size or flexible sizes, and can contain one or more grid items that can be individually defined as fixed size or flexible. So we have some options on if we want these to be a specific size or if we want them to scale in proportion in a certain way. Just like with the Flexbox, the W3C schools now recommend the grid layout. and it is supported in browsers. And then, like with the Flexbox, we are going to need to configure a grid container. All this writing of birds has me writing grid incorrectly. So we're going to use the display property, and you have to set it to grid. So uses display property set to grid. I'll go ahead and put that in quotes. Horizontal and vertical grid lines that mark rows and columns are referred to as grid tracks. I'm going to show you some illustrations from the book that are going to help a lot of this make more sense. Then we have grid cell is a grid item. So similar to the table, we're going to be thinking in the terms of cells. Grid area is rectangle that can contain one or more grid items. We have grid gap is optional gutter. All right, so we're gonna take a look at the textbook. Let me see which page this is gonna be on. All right, so page 268 is gonna talk about the grid layout. We have this example talking about how you would set the display property to grid, similar to what we did before where we had our container. We're setting that to grid, and then we would have all of our children that are going to be inside of it, our grid items. So where it gets a little bit different is because we are creating information that's in multiple rows and columns, we have to kind of think about that structure similar to what we had to when we were working with the table. So here we actually have this same information that we just wrote up. A grid is comprised of horizontal and vertical grid lines. So here we have the lines. So the lines are going to be the exterior of our cell space. So that's kind of the edges of what we're working with. They're calling them grid tracks. So those are the tracks going around. The grid item is going to be where we place our item, whether it's going to have an image inside of it, if it's going to be our navigation is going to be in that section. The grid area is the rectangle that can contain one or more grid items. So that's going to be the whole space. So if we were thinking of this like our table, the grid area would be the whole table. And then all of these different grid cells inside of it would be our different table rows or our table data cells. The grid gap is optional, and it indicates an empty area or gutter between items in the grid container. So if we think about each of these, if we wanted to, we could add a gutter. So the gutter is going to be the space. You could think of it like the margins that are between your different columns of information. If any of you are familiar with like comic strips, comic books, you always have your gutters that go in between the different panels. Same thing with like magazines and everything, you have those gutters. So the gutters, that's essentially your white space that's in between these. So in a lot of ways, just like with the Flexbox, there's a lot of potential for working with your white space and really controlling how you want it to behave responsively. Instead of necessarily just having to use padding and margins, you still can use padding and margins. But we have some options here to use that grid gap instead if we really wanted to. So here they're drawing out this kind of general layout. We have 3 columns going across. We have 2 rows. And so what ends up happening is you designate what space each of these items is going to end up taking up. So we're going to work with the bird example again as a way of sort of being able to compare these to each other. So underneath our notes, we're going to go ahead and essentially type up what we have here. If you want to, if you still have the other file open, what we're going to do is essentially copy this gallery and these images. I'm going to do this. So I'm going to copy this in. Let's save this real quick. You could refresh it so we can actually see our page so far. All right, so before we go too far into our different settings, like this is essentially going to be the next part we're going to look at, is this configure grid columns and grid rows. So we're going to go up to our top section in our styles, and I'm going to go ahead and add in gallery display is going to be set to grid. So again, the container is what is going to have the display property set to it. And there's going to be a couple of different things that we can do with our grid. So we're going to look at some options. I think what we're going to actually do is we're going to add in some notes before we cover this. So underneath our unordered list, let's go ahead and we'll add in an H2. We're going to say grid columns and grid rows. And I'm going to create an unordered list. So the first one I'm going to say grid template columns, list numbers like 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. So we have our 6 images. We're essentially going to do something like this. So what you want to do is you want to specify for the columns how much space you want them to take up. So right now, this is essentially a fixed dimension. We're working with a fixed dimension. We're going to kind of look at how you can work with flexible dimensions in a little bit. So I'm going to say that the first column is 200 pixels, second column is 200 pixels, third column is 300 pixels. So that's why we're listing these numbers. If we had fewer columns, we'd list fewer numbers. If we had more columns, we'd list more numbers. We're going to actually use these same ones in our example. Then we're going to have our grid template rows. So you would list numbers like 100 pixels, 100 pixels. So in this case, we just have the 2 different rows, so we would only have to list 2 numbers for those 2 rows. Now, empty spaces or empty space can be created by making the grid sizes bigger than the images. So rather than necessarily having to add in the grid gap, you could just make the images a little bigger. We'll look at that too. Can use pixels, percentages, flex factor, unit, auto, min max, or repeat. Page 270 has a really great table that you can look at that gives you an example of all this information. So we're going to go to the top and we're going to add in some more styles to our gallery. We're going to say grid template columns, and we're going to set this to 220 pixels, 220 pixels, 220 pixels. So if you remember back, our images, the width is actually 200. So what we're doing is we're essentially adding 20 pixels around it. to give a little bit of space. We'll do grid template rows. And our images were 150 pixels, so we're going to do 170. Save that. And we can refresh. So we have our grid right now. We have the 20 pixels that are extra. So it's adding this gutter essentially in between everything. So the next thing that we're going to look at is this grid gap. And as I mentioned before, it's going to be this space that is in between. So we could actually write this and do H2 grid gap. Probably do this in the list as well. And I'm just going to kind of list these. And one of the big things that I want to mention is you have some options for the property. So here we have a list of the old and the new. So it's really just kind of reducing extra words. So we have grid, column, gap is now column, gap. And then we have grid, row, gap is now row, gap. So either of these would work. It's sort of up to you. And we have grid, gap is now gap. So the grid column gap, like you would think, it's going to affect the gap between the columns. The grid row gap and the row gap are going to affect the gaps between the rows. The grid gap and the gap is going to just affect all of them kind of equally. Now, if you wanted to, what you could do is we could actually go up here and instead we could go and we could apply these gaps instead if we really wanted to. So for example, we could reduce this down to 200 and then we could go and we could add gap property. We could say grid gap, set this to 20 pixels, just to show how this is written. Refresh. So it's going to look the same. It's just now we have this different number. We could double check that it actually changed. Set this 30. So now we have a little bit more space. Now there's another interesting way that we can work with these numbers. So right now we have a fixed dimension. There's some other things that we can do. So for example, with our grid template columns, we have the exact same size for all of them. So what we could do instead, I'll just write this underneath so it'll essentially overwrite. So you have both in your notes. So we're going to do grid template columns, and then we're going to type in repeat, and then we're going to say how many times we're going to repeat. So we're going to have 3 different instances, and then we're going to set this to 200 pixels. And then we could do kind of the same thing with the rows, or another option we have is we could just set it to auto. So it'll kind of figure out, depending on what's there, what would make the most sense. We could look at another option for our grid gap. So let's see, let's do grid gap. I'm gonna set this to 2M, do gap 2M. For some reason, it's not recognizing gap. I don't know if that's a problem with Sublime. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to save this, refresh. All right, so the next thing that we're going to look at is those grid line numbers. So the grid line numbers are going to give us the option of organizing our information based off of the space that it is within the overall grid. And I'm going to try to find this other drawing that's in your textbook that I think is also a really good illustration. So this is a good example for why you might want to use the grid lines rather than just specifying the rows and like what the sizes of those are, because these numbers are fixed, but technically we could go and we could add different sizes in here that are going to be flexible. But a reason why we might want to use these lines is it gives us the option of having the elements that we want to put into it. We can have it so they space beyond the individual cells. So for example, this header is going from line 1 in the column all the way to line 3 in the column. And then it's going from line 1 to line 2 in the row. The nav is going from 1 to 2 in the column and then 2 to 3 in the rows. The main is going from 2 to 3 in the columns and 2 to 3 in the rows. The footer is going from 1 to 3 in the columns and then 3 to 4 in the rows. So we essentially have the header and the footer are merging together two cells, and then the nav and the main are just a single cell themselves. And then we also have the option of having the different dimensions, so that way we have this other ratio that we might want. So when we're working with our grid line numbers, what you would do instead of creating this container where you are specifying the different sizes of the cells within, instead you would take your element that you want to specify and you're going to specify the grid row and the grid column, and then you're going to define what those numbers are going to be. So here we have the header it has both a grid row and grid column numbers, and you do want to use this / to designate what the starting and end points of each of these are going to be. Luckily, with the homework assignment that you're going to have, it's going to help prompt you and give you an idea of how to write this. So you don't have to worry necessarily too much about writing this from scratch, but you do want to be kind of comfortable with it. I usually suggest for your final project, if you do want to go the route of working with the grid layout, draw things out on a sheet of paper or something, just so that way you have an idea of how things are actually lining up, and it'll help make that easier so you know where those numbers are coming from. So we're not necessarily going to mess any further with this example. I want to take a look at the examples that I have linked from this CSS grid layout module. So here they have this example of working with a website, the header, menu, main. They have a kind of an aside, they have a footer, they have information about browser support. Here they are showing that they have this div that's called a grid container. It has numbers for all of these different grid items. These grid items are essentially in the cells within that. Then they work with the showing kind of how to use the display property. Again, the display property is applied to the container. And then they give you an example working with it as grid or inline grid. Here they have some examples of looking at the grid columns and the grid rows. Here we have the grid gaps in between. Talking about the grid lines and how to kind of think about how to count which cell you're in. And they even actually go a little further. Your textbook doesn't talk about this, but they do have this example of working with the property grid column start and grid column end. So you could technically write your numbers this way if you wanted to say where it's starting, where it's ending. Your textbook is going to have you do a really good example where you're going to practice working with these. I would suggest doing this example. I'm not going to bother having us download more files to do this. So I want you to do that in your own time. this has some really good information where it's talking about progressive enhancement with the grid. It says the design strategy for using grid layout is to first configure the web page layout so it displays well in non-supporting browsers. So older browsers might not be able to support working with a grid layout. And so they suggest that you have sort of a backup option to work with. So they have first, configure the web page layout so it displays well in non-supporting browsers. So you'd have whatever your default layout would be. And then next, use a new technique called a CSS feature query to check for grid support and then configure the grid layout to be used by supporting browsers. So what that would look like is creating this at supports, and then you would add in display grid. So if it is supported, it will apply it. If it's not, you would have the styles above it that would be kind of for older browsers to look at. Here's another example. We have at supports display grid, and then we have all of our grid information. We have the wrapper has display grid set to it. It has this information for the grid template columns and the grid template rows, and then we have a specification for each of the individual elements inside header, nav, main, footer, how those are going to fit inside of those cells. So you're going to do something very similar with the homework assignment. So the next item we're going to take a look at is the viewport meta tag. There are multiple uses for meta tags. We've looked a little bit at meta tags. So if you look at just any of our examples, we have the meta character set, for example, that we use. And this chapter in particular is going to take a look at working with the viewport meta tag. Your textbook says it was created as an Apple extension that helps with displays on mobile devices. I really like the documentation for this, again, on W3C School. So if you go to HTML meta tag, there's some really great information. I'm going to see if I can zoom in a little bit. So here they have an example, and depending on if you are going to study websites further, I'm going to just kind of explain what some of these other ones are. So the meta tag in general allows for you to add in data that you want to share with the browser. And so we've been looking at working with the character set, which sets that information. So we have UTF-8. There's some other really great ones though. For example, if you were to go on further and study search engine optimization, descriptions and keywords are often used to assist with search engines being able to look through your website and also rank it. So if you're looking to improve the findability of your website and then also kind of the ranking of it, you can use different keywords that help describe your content. And you can even add those to the head section of your website. So in this case, the meta name, you can set that to keywords, and then you can specify keywords that correlate with the page, the actual individual page of your website. You wouldn't want to necessarily just fill it with a ton of keywords. Usually you want to pick maybe 3 to 5 keywords that really fit the content of your page. You don't want to spam it with a ton of stuff. The description is actually what is going to show up if you go to a search engine and you search up websites. You'll often see a little bit of a description. So it could be maybe a sentence or two long, just kind of giving a general overview of that page or your website in general. So those are both really great meta tags. Those are really great uses of working with the meta tag. Author, you can author your content if you want to. Right now, we've been just adding a comment to the top of your page, but author works really well in addition to that. Then we have the viewport. So you can actually write this information exactly this way on all of your pages. You don't really have to worry about changing this. So what we're looking at is we have the viewport. We are choosing the content. We're setting the width equal to the device's width. So whatever the width of the device is, that's going to change the size of how things are represented on the visual plane of the screen. And then we're setting the initial scale too, so that way we have a better idea of how things are going to scale. So I'm just going to kind of read through this information. The meta tag defines metadata about an HTML document. Metadata is data or information about data. Meta tags always go inside of the head element and are typically used to specify character set, page description, keywords, author of the document, and viewport settings. Metadata will not be displayed on the page, but is machine parsable. Metadata is used by browsers how to display content or reload a page, search engines, for example, keywords, and other web services. There is a method to let web designers take control over the viewport, the user's visible area of a web page, through the meta tag. Browser support, attributes, so you could take a look at that. Here they have different examples. So we're going to go down to setting the viewport. The viewport is the user's visible area of a web page. It varies with the device. It will be smaller on a mobile phone than on a computer screen. You should include the following meta element in all of your web pages. So I'm going to actually jump down a little bit real quick. If you remember back to working with kind of early mobile phones before we really knew what we were doing, if you've ever tried to look at a website before and it seems very tiny and you have to zoom in really close to actually read anything, it basically looks like a desktop on your phone. One of the issues that you might be facing is a website that has not specified the viewport meta tag to make it so that way you can actually see the content scaled to the device you're looking at. So here we have an example on the left of what the content would look like without the viewport meta tag, and then we have information of what that would look like on the right with the viewport meta tag. So it's going to just help scale the information so it actually makes sense for the device that you're looking at. So this gives the browser instructions on how to control the page's dimensions and scaling. Width equals device width. Part says the width of the page should follow the screen width of the device. Initial scale part says the initial zoom level when the page is first loaded. So pretty straightforward. So what we want to do is we just want to copy this, and from now on you should really use this for all of your examples. I'll probably forget, but just somewhere in the head section you want to start adding in this content. And you definitely want to do that for your final project. You should start doing it for your homework assignment as well. So I'm going to save this page. Let's create a new file. We'll call this media.html. So since I already had this copied, I'm going to just go ahead and copy the viewport information, meta character set, title, media queries, and we may or may not use embedded styles. It's not necessarily a great idea, but to save space, I might do it. I'm going to have us add in some other nodes. These aren't necessarily going to relate to media queries, but I don't really have another spot to place it, and I don't necessarily want to open up a Word document. These are just looking at some other things that you can do when you are adding styles for a mobile site. So what the textbook is going to allow for us to do is we're going to have the opportunity of creating styles for mobile, tablet, and desktop styles. So there's going to be some things that we can do on a mobile device that we can't necessarily do on others. So an example of that would be using a link for a telephone number. So in your homework assignment, you might have some information in the bottom section saying what the contact information is. But what we can do is we can create this link, do tel, tel, we'll just put some placeholder information in. And I'm going to go ahead and just full screen this. And above this, I'm going to put telephone number on mobile. So if somebody was on a mobile device and they were looking at the website, they would be able to click on this link and it's going to open up their phone's phone section. And it's going to allow for them to actually call that number versus if you're on a desktop, you don't necessarily have the ability to make a phone call from your desktop. So this wouldn't necessarily work, but it is kind of an added function. So this is something where you could have the desktop style and the tablet styles set so that way this link shows as just the regular information. And then for your mobile styles, you could actually have it switch to show this so that way people could actually make use of this on a mobile phone. We're going to look at we're going to look at another example of this. So H2, we're going to do text message on mobile. And so we would do a link. This time though, we're going to do SMS, and then we could do our same fake number. All right, so that just covers some basic information of working with information kind of particular to mobile devices. So now we're going to actually get into the media query part. So media queries, and I'm going to go ahead and put this above. Media queries are Boolean statements that evaluate screen devices. There are several types. All screen, only, and print. You can specify information such as maximum width, minimum width, maximum height, minimum height, orientation, minimum device width, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some fake links to, actually we might turn them into real links, but we're going to go up to our head section and I'm going to create a link to styles.css. Relationship is going to be that it's a style sheet. Now, what we're going to do is we have our href, we have our rel. We're going to add in another attribute inside of our link. And we're going to call this media. And this is where we're going to choose which of these that we want this to be equal to. Do we want it to be equal to screen? Do we want it to be equal to print? That's sort of up to you. We can say if we want it to only be the screen. So you could say print only. We could say screen only. We could say all if we wanted to. I'm just going to have this be screen. But we can use some logic and we can add in some other information. So let's do only screen. And then we can add in some other logic. We say and then we can specify what this and is going to be. So for example, I'm going to do and minimum width is going to be 768 pixels. And then I might say something else, and maximum width 1024 pixels. So what would happen is the browser is going to load the page. It's going to look and see, is this being shown on a screen? So the difference would be if we were looking at this as a printed style. So if I was going to go to file print, this wouldn't show up. So if it's a screen, and then the smallest it can be is 768. So it's not going to apply to phones. It's only going to apply to larger devices. Maximum width 1024. So it's also not going to apply to very large monitors. We might want to change this though. It's kind of focusing a little too much on a very specific area. What we would have to do in this case is we might have to have another style. So for example, let's do mobile.css. So we're going to do only screen, and maybe this time I'll just do maximum width 767 pixels. So this is going to pick up where the other one left off. It's going to cover all the smaller styles. Now, when you are applying these, you want to think about the order they're going to be written in. There isn't necessarily a right and wrong order for these. It depends on how you apply your styles. So what you would want to do is you would want to consider what the majority of your styles are, the ones that are going to apply to everything that you want. You're going to want to put those first. And then anything that's going to be different, you would want to overwrite the styles that come before. So for example, what I could do is I could have some styles in this first link that will perhaps, I'll take this telephone style and I'll actually change that. Maybe I want to add an ID or something to this to make it easier to grab that. And I might want to say display none. And then when I come in with my mobile style, I could go and I could technically overwrite that and I could say to display that as a block, and it'll actually have that pop up and swap between the two of them. So that's going to be up to you. You just want to make sure that you think about the logic of how these are going to overwrite each other. So you can link to multiple style sheets if you want. We can also do these all within the same style sheet though. So we're going to kind of do that next. I'm going to create a new file. Save. I forget if I called this I think it was styles.css. All right, so what we can do is we can use that same logic and we can create a media rule where we would say at, and then you would create your rule. So, so at media, and then we could say only screen and maximum width 480 pixels, for example. And then within this section, you're going to have a curly bracket. So for your homework, what you're going to do is you're going to have majority of your styles. They're all going to be up above this. In the case of your book, what they're going to have you do is they're going to have you take all of the styles that you've created up to this point that are specific to the desktop. They're going to have you remove some of those styles. They're going to find whatever the basic styles are that apply to everything. They're going to have you add a few mobile specific styles, and the top part is going to end up being your mobile styles, but it's just going to be kind of generally stated. And then what they're going to have you do is you're going to create some media styles that are going to be specific to whatever the logic is for the tablet styles. So they might have you specify screen, and then I'm not really sure what the cutoff for this is, if they're going to use maximum width or minimum width, but they're essentially going to have you add in your tablet styles, and then they're going to have you add in something in here, and then you're going to have your desktop styles. So anything that kind of fit the logic of the bottom part would overwrite the styles that you've set above that. So you want to be careful how you choose to do that. Now, the way that they're going to have you do this is considered a mobile first approach, meaning that mobile is the default style and then anything else is overwriting it. But it's sort of up to you. You could do the opposite. You could have desktop be your starter styles, and then you could overwrite your desktop styles with the tablet and then mobile at the bottom. It doesn't matter as long as you have the logic written correctly. It should apply and overwrite the other styles perfectly fine. So there's not just one way to do that. But so like an example would be you could have your navigation. Let's just say our navigation width is set to 100. And then maybe here, navigation is going to be set to 50. So if my navigation, by default, my navigation is going to be 100 pixels. If my screen is a screen, or if the way I'm looking at it is a screen and it is, so this is maximum width 480, so can't be any greater than that. Anything smaller than 480 is going to have a navigation of 50 pixels. And then I haven't added any logic to the bottom one, so it's technically going to overwrite all of these, and no matter what the navigation for the screen is going to be 20 pixels. So this video has already become quite long, so I'm going to leave the rest for you to look at. And I think that makes the most sense anyways, because you ideally would want to download these files to really work with. This is going to go into more information on working with the media queries. Make sure that you follow the example and try it out in the book. They have some drawings they're going to show you, and then their own project. They have information about working with the grid in conjunction with it. Then they have some information about working with flexible images. Really, the only thing that you need to think about here is start thinking about how you can use your CSS to change your image sizes. They do have some information on using cover. So being able to work with cover to change how your image is kind of fitting in this space, working with height, setting that to auto, maybe using a percentage, using properties like maximum width or minimum width. So those are all really great to use for making your images responsive. Something else that's really great to think about is working with a picture element. So this is going to allow for you to actually change out which images are going to show depending on how large this space is. So I'm going to just kind of go down here where you have the picture element, and then you're going to choose the source media. You're going to use the same sort of logic of So this has minimum width is 1200 pixels. So if the minimum width is 1200 pixels, you are going to bring in the large image. If the minimum width is 800 pixels, you're going to bring in the medium image. If the dimensions smaller than 320, you're going to bring in the small image. So it's going to kind of figure out what's appropriate to the size of the window or what you're looking at, and it's going to actually bring in different sourced images instead, and then you actually have the image itself as sort of a fallback to look at. So you could sort of use this as a thumbnail or a really good way of just trying to make the speed of downloading the image go a lot quicker, because that's something that definitely is an inconvenience. There's also some links to great resources for you to be able to test different images and working with mobile. Here we have testing mobile display. So we have Google Chrome development tools. We have Opera Mobile Classic Emulator, iPhone Emulator. So if you wanted to, you could test those out. If you look in your browser, let me see if I can... If you right click and you go to inspect element, we'll look at this a little bit more in a future video, but if you go here, you can actually click on different devices to kind of preview what these pages would look like on different devices. And so this can actually help a lot for being able to see how things are looking on mobile, tablet, and desktop. Before I end this, I did have a bunch of students in previous semesters ask questions and get a little bit confused on the homework. So I just want to kind of go over this a little bit. So for the Pacific Trails Resort, they're going to give you these wireframe drawings of the 3 different styles. It's the same thing for the yoga one. They'll give you some drawings so that way you have a clear idea of what it's going to look like. Basically what you're doing is you are removing the styles of what you've created for now that's specific to desktop. You're creating a very basic mobile page, and then you're going to move some of those desktop styles into a new app media rule, and then you kind of add more styles into it. So here we have an image of what these 3 finished ones are going to look like. They're going to give you the kind of breakdown. So here they have configure a small single column layout. So you're essentially starting with this point. They're going to give you all these steps. So even when it's larger and full screen, it's going to still kind of maintain this look. Then you're going to create your other app media rules, and those new rules are going to overwrite this basic style and make them look more like this. And they have a couple of examples of what this will look like on the different pages. Here they have some illustrations working with the grid. And you'll notice they give you this information so that'll help make it a little bit easier. Here we have this illustration. Same thing with the yoga studio. We have our 3 different wireframes drawn out. We're going to remove some of the desktop styles and make everything look like this small display for starters. So here's kind of our final product of what we're hoping for it to look like. You're going to work on making that small single column layout. You're going to remove some things, add some stuff, and then everything will sort of look, and it looks like they don't give you an image of what it'll sort of look like in that in between, but basically everything will kind of look the same for starters. And then you're going to go and you're going to add those styles to the app media rules, and those will kind of overwrite depending on the styles. And make sure that you also add the viewport meta tag. That'll be something else that you need to have. All right, so I do have a link here for BD queries. I really like this example. This is linked in your textbook. And I believe that we've already looked at this another time, but when you're starting to think about your final project, this would be a really good idea to go and take a look at this and just kind of see what sort of settings change, whether it's taking the navigation and replacing it with a hamburger menu, or if it's taking some of the background images or textures and removing them, so that way you can kind of reduce load times. But there's just a lot of ways that you can kind of change things for mobile devices. A book that I really like is Mobile Web Designer's Idea Book. So if you are interested in this idea of going for a mobile approach, this book is really great for being able to see the kind of how somebody's taken the mobile version or the desktop version and turned it into a mobile version. It also kind of breaks down the different aspects of working with mobile designs. So once you've gone through all of this, make sure that you also take a look at the final project description video that's going to walk you through the final project, and make sure that you comment on the final project proposal. So this is going to cover everything for this chapter and taking a look at Flexbox and grid layouts. If you have any questions, make sure to comment in the discussion or send me an email.